What's happening, y'all? This is episode 1 of the Comrades Classroom podcast, put on by the People's Coalition and our beautiful friends at the North Orange County Mutual Aid Coalition. We're using this platform to provide more folks access to our discussion outside of the weekly meetings. The purpose of this podcast will be to introduce, summarize, and recap key highlights from our brilliant comrades that lead the discussions each week. On this episode, we recap our Comrades Classroom discussion led by our friends at the Palestinian Youth Movement.
I feel my body will perish, my love will last forever. I hold you down eternally like you my last endeavor. And when I tell you I got you, I don't mean I possess unconditional support, and then I will digress. Ooh, you know I savor love. It's that labor of love. Ooh, you know I savor love. It's that labor. You know I savor.
What's happening, y'all? I'm Daniel,
I'm Gabe.
and we're gonna be your host for the Comrades Classroom podcast. But really, like throughout this whole thing, really, we're just gonna be projecting the voices of the homies that pull up to the podcast each week, and trying to provide y'all a quality recap of our discussions, and really get this political education work that we've been trying to do expanding outside of just a couple little projects, but really try to provide as many people access as we can. Because we know that reading isn't always accessible for everybody. It's not always everyone's first choice. But when we talk about the liberation of our people, when we talk about the liberation of colonized people, political education has to be in the conversation. It has to work side by side with the direct action in the community. So that's really what we're trying to do here, is not only collaborate with our folks at the North Orange County Mutual Aid Coalition, but also come back around and offer this political education to our community.
All right, so we're going to start by going over some of the resources provided to us by the Palestinian Youth Movement for the political education meeting that they led for our folks in our community.
Yeah, they put out this super dope Palestine 101 document on Canva, but we also have it posted to our Comrades Classroom website that you can find in our Instagram bio. At the People's Coalition _, so you can find that there.
And also the URL for that is www.tinyurl.com/comradesclassroom.
Yep. Yeah, so let's jump into it. So Palestine 101, they describe it as a brief introduction to the history of the occupation of Palestine. And in our spaces, we try to precede all political education work with defining terms, just so that we come into a space not assuming that everyone is at the same knowledge base. But we can all get to that space. But it's important to break down the vocab that we're going to use, so we can all put language right to what we're experiencing out in the world. So what is settler colonialism, right? So they define this as colonialism specifically is a system of economic, political, and cultural domination by an outside entity over an indigenous population. But they situate this against settler colonialism, right, which has been perpetrated by European-led empires, i.e. the U.S., i.e. Canada, i.e. Australia, i.e. Israel and the Zionist movement, right?
South Africa,
yeah,
New Zealand.
We can go forever, right? So settler colonialism is a distinct type of colonialism where the primary goal is to exterminate and or replace the indigenous people to make room for the creation of the colonizers of our own society. And what we talk about a lot with settler colonialism, right, is the mechanisms that are used to maintain it. And so it's making room for the creation of the colonizer society, but that requires a number of mechanisms of power and control, right, that are used as violence against our people and our folks.
And then principally, right, within that is the constant drive towards assimilation, right? So this is truly the annihilation of whatever indigeneity exists within a space and the creation and perpetuation of this settler colonial state.
Yeah. And when we talk about Palestine, a lot of Western narratives are going to frame the issue as a centuries-old religious conflict, but we know that's not true, right? It's imperative that we understand the true nature of the Palestine through the lens of settler colonialism. It's a relationship of occupier and occupied, oppressor and oppressed, usurper and usurped. This is not a conflict, right? This is an occupation.
Yes.
And real quick, we're going to play a clip from Ghassan Kanafani, who was a leader within the People for the Liberation of Palestine, and it's an interview that they did with a settler media source. So here that is.
The Beirut leader of the Popular Front is Ghassan Kanafani. He was born in Palestine but fled in 1948, as he puts it, from Zionist terror. Since then, he's been plotting the destruction of both the Zionists and the reactionary Arabs.
I know what I know,
Thank you.
really, that the history of the world is always the history of weak people fighting strong people. Of weak people who has a correct case fighting strong people who use their strength to exploit the weak.
Turn to the fighting that's been going on in Jordan in the recent weeks. It's your organization that's been one side of the fight. What has it achieved?
One thing, that we have a case to fight for. That's very much. These people, the Palestinian people, prefer to die standing than to lose its case. We achieved proving that the king is wrong. We achieved proving that this nation is going to continue fighting till victory. We achieved that our people could never be defeated. We achieved teaching every single person in this world that we are a small, brave nation who are going to fight to the last drop of blood to put justice for ourselves after the world failed in giving it to us. This is what we achieved.
It does seem that the war, the civil war, has been quite fruitless.
It's not a civil war. It's a people defending themselves against a fascist government, which you are defending because just King Hussein has an Arab passport. It's not a civil war.
Well, the conflict...
It's not a conflict. It's a liberation movement fighting for justice.
Well, whatever it might be best called...
It's not whatever, because this is where the problems start. Because this is what makes you answer all your questions, ask you all your questions. This is exactly where the problems start. This is a people who is discriminated, is fighting for his rights. This is the story. If you will say it's a civil war, then your questions will be justified. If you will say it's a conflict, then of course it's a surprise to know what's happening.
Why won't your organization engage in peace talks with the Israelis?
You don't mean exactly peace talks. You mean capitulation, surrendering.
Why not just talk?
Talk to whom?
Talk to the Israeli leaders.
That's kind of conversation between the sword and the neck, you mean?
Well, if there were no swords and no guns in the room, you could still talk.
No, I had never seen any talk between a colonialist case and a national liberation movement.
But despite this, why not talk?
Talk about what?
Talk about the possibility of not fighting.
Not fighting for what?
Not fighting at all, no matter what for.
Yeah, people usually fight for something and they stop fighting for something. So you can't tell me even why should we speak about what?
Well, stop fighting.
For what? Or talk about stop fighting, why?
Talk to stop fighting, to stop the death and the misery, the destruction, the pain.
The misery and the destruction and the pain and the death of whom?
Of Palestinians, of Israelis, of Arabs.
Of the Palestinian people who are uprooted, thrown in the camps, living in starvation, killed for 20 years, and forbidden to use even the name Palestinians.
They're better that way than dead, though.
Maybe to you, but to us, it's not. To us, to liberate our country, to have dignity, to have respect, to have our mere human rights, is something as essential as life itself.
You called King Hussein a fascist. Who else amongst the Arab leaders are you totally opposed to?
We consider the Arab governments two kinds. Something we call reactionaries, who are completely connected with imperialists, like King Hussein government, like Saudi Arabian government, like Moroccan government, Tunisian government. And then we had some other Arab governments which we call the military petit bourgeoisie governments. That's like Syria, Iraq, Egypt, Algeria, so on.
Just to end with, let me go back to the hijacking of the aircraft. On reflection, do you think that is now a mistake?
We didn't make a mistake in hijacking them. The contrast. We did one of the most correct things we ever did.
Yeah, so, and I love that interview, right? He's so the interviewer, right, has no capacity to understand the colonized perspective, right, on how it is an occupation, right, and how that the
sort of
violence,
like obsession with having conversation, the obsession with removing violence, the obsession with like just having peace talks,
and it being the oppressed job, right, to create the space for peace and to approach the oppressor, right, the doer of violence, the doer of harm, to create this peace, to engage in these peace talks, right? So
right, and he drops that line, right? He says like it's kind of the conversation between the sword and the neck, right? Like what conversation is there really to be had there? I think that's fundamental to all this, and you know, sort of in order to understand this occupation of Palestine, it's super important to ground this in a historical understanding of this geographic region. So the Ottoman Empire had ruled Palestine until the Arab revolts of 1916 to 1918. And following that period, the European powers were able to slide in, as settler colonizers always do, and take advantage of the instability and the revolts taking place. So like in the context of the start of World War I, there's this moment in which the settler colonial powers kind of come together, France, Britain, Russia, and Italy, to among themselves negotiate and divide up this geographic region to best suit their individual settler colonial interests. So specifically how this land was all divided up, France was given possession of modern-day Syria and Lebanon. Britain was assigned Iraq, Kuwait, Jordan, and most of Palestine. So within this framework, you can see sort of the boundaries of colonization being drawn. This agreement is known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and it's from this that the tensions that we see today.
Yeah, right. I mean, and the agreement itself, we know, right, was is a secret agreement between colonial powers, right, which is the only way. I mean,
we know how it goes.
Yeah, we know how it goes. And I mean, it was on October in 1917 when a revolution in Russia, right, began, and wherein this agreement was exposed to the public and called the Agreement of Colonial Thieves, causing a big political scandal, right, for Britain and France. Following World War I, the British Mandate of Palestine was formalized by the League of Nations.
And shout out the Bolshevik Revolution, you know, releasing these colonial secrets.
For real.
For real. So then in 1917, there's sort of this inclusion of this new ideological construction for looking at the world. It's in this moment that you start getting the communication between the British and prominent Zionists, right? And Zionism really is grounded in establishing for the first time Israel as the primary state for the Jewish people.
Yeah, the homeland.
The homeland for the Jewish people. And so I think, you know, before we move any further, maybe we should talk a little about Zionism.
Yeah, I mean, even before that, right, we just talking directly to that aftermath of World War I. It's right, yeah. I mean, it's when the Palestine, right, was established as a Zionist colony, and Zionist settlers began, right, to come throughout Palestine and settle throughout Palestine in the 1920s through the 30s, right, and the Arab nations launched an uprising against the British and their support for Zionist colonialism in 1936, which, as colonizers do, right, they use, right, the arm of imperialism, the strength of imperialism, to violently crush any uprisings against it, and right, so that's what we see happen, and then we see, like, throughout, right, this which is reinforced by violence, right? Zionism as an ideology is created. And it is the primary ideology behind settler colonialism in Palestine. It's a political movement to establish the Jewish state, and its origins are associated with German writer Theodor Herzl.
And I think that's really important to drill in on, right? Is like understanding where it is that Zionism is coming from. This isn't like an indigenous movement in that region, right? This is truly happening in a settler colonizer nation, being projected onto another area of the world. And I think most crucially here, it's absolutely important to drill on how Zionism is being created, who it's being created in concert with, right?
Yeah.
Who might that be?
Yeah, well, the imperial power of the U.S. No, but I mean, I think you're spot on, and with that, like being able to identify this as a Zionist movement is key, and it's the exact reason why. Specifically the Palestinian youth movement in this case, but other leaders from around the globe, they don't legitimize, right, the Israeli state, right? They identify it as a colonizing state, as a Zionist state, because from the jump, right, that's what it was designed to be, right? A state that was implanted to create the Jewish homeland, and so the founder of Zionism, it wasn't only Palestine that he had his eye on for the Zionist project, right? He was also looking towards Uganda and Argentina to advance this project.
Which is super important.
That it's a project, right? He had these ideas to implant this project and specifically to colonize different regions of the world.
And sort of disconnecting this whole idea that this is the return of the Israelites to Israel. I think that's really important, is that even within the Zionist movement, Israel wasn't central. Right? It was just the settler colonial project. That was what this was built around. Uganda and Argentina have no proximity to Israel.
Yeah.
But yet, now we can see the language today and how this is sort of the way that Zionism and any critique of Zionism is cloaked in anti-Semitism. It's all grounded in that. And speaking of anti-Semitism, right? Like this idea that Zionism is built in concert as well with the anti-Semites who are trying to remove the Jewish people from Europe. I mean, like, look, we know what this is. This is bad.
Period. Yeah. Period. And one thing I like that I think this Palestine 101 document elaborates on and tries to get us to focus on is the distinct relationship to settler colonialism that oppressed peoples in Palestine, oppressed peoples in the Americas have to one another, right? It's the same violence. It's the same system that is perpetuating it, right? And so the purpose of the colonial state in these two regions specifically, right, is to disperse, dispossess, and erase the indigenous population, right? And we have to highlight that, and also not only highlight it, but to draw the distinctions so that we as a people can mobilize in such a way that we're identifying where this violence is occurring and how we can not only become accomplices with, right, folks in Palestine trying to liberate themselves, but learn from them, learn from their past, learn from their mistakes, learn from their victories, right, and grow from there. And so I think that's what something the Palestinian youth movement does so beautifully is they don't only focus on the liberation of Palestine, right? They highlight that this is a unique violence of settler colonialism that is experienced by oppressed people across the globe.
Right, it's part of this broader settler colonial project. And anytime we start trying to break a historical moment out of that framework, we fall into these same traps of settler colonial ahistory, right? It is the illogical logic of settler colonialism is constantly justifying, rationalizing, legitimating harm and violence against people who are viewed as other or less because of their indigeneity, because of their connection to that land.
Exactly. And so to transition just a little bit, we're going to jump into what the Palestinian people identify as Nakba, which in Arabic translates directly into English as the catastrophe or a disaster. And so this is the catastrophe of 1948. And Gabe, you want to talk a little more about that?
Yeah, so this is the exodus, the beginning of the diaspora of the Palestinian people. In this moment, there's over 700,000 Palestinians who were forced to flee as they were the victims of like this campaign of terror and violence perpetrated by the Zionist state. There were Zionist militias going into Palestinian communities, terrorizing and murdering the people there, destroying their homes. two specific militias were the Irgun and the Lehi, who were responsible for the Deir Yassin massacres. These are in 1948 as well. And it's estimated that over 600 folks were killed in this devastation.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to highlight that Nakba, right, the year of 1948, the catastrophe, is identified as a symbolic year, right, of the expulsion, right, of their people, but we have to highlight that it is ongoing, right? It has continued throughout this day, and maybe folks have seen, right, this image of the Palestinian land that is now occupied, and how it's shrunk from 1917, and then we can go to the start of 1948, the start of Nakba, and then we can go all the way through 2020. You could see how their people have been dispossessed, how the land has been colonized, and how their access, right, to sovereignty and freedom is constricted year to year, and it's similar, right, to those maps of the U.S.
And this is the beginning of the process that ends up barring so many Palestinian peoples from returning to Palestine,
Yes,
right?
yeah.
So it's at this moment that you get not only the sort of geographic mapping of the decline or the oppression or the colonization of Palestinian land, but you also get that settler aspect in here. And it's always
Yep.
important to talk about both of these. It's the removal of these people, and in this sense, that diasporic expulsion of peoples from this area.
Yeah, so there's these two key dates. It's 1948, Nakba, the catastrophe, and 1967, Naksa, which translates to the day of setback, right? And both of these dates highlight people who were expelled and are barred from reentry, right? And both of these dates signify years where thousands, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were forced to flee, and since then have not been allowed to return to their the land, right? Their land.
And I mean, I think principally also this is a good moment to speak about how the propaganda of settler colonialism functions, right? Because like within Israeli historical retellings, these are actually framed as like moments of Arab aggression, right? And so it's important to recognize how these forms of the rationalization of settler colonialism exist in America, they exist in Australia, they exist in the Zionist state, right? These are all these different foundational mythologies that are all constructed to justify these movements.
Exactly, right? And as always, when we talk about this type of violence and this type of trauma that has been inflicted on our people, we don't ever want to only highlight or center the violence, right? And center what was done and perpetrated by the colonizer. So I think what's incredible about a lot of the resources we'll talk through on this podcast, and specifically this one provided by the Palestinian Youth Movement, is from the jump, right? There was resistance to the colonization, right? It's been, right, fuck that since the jump, fuck the state, and fuck the violence that they perpetrate against our people. And so I think a key date is in December of 1987, which was a year that strengthened the Palestinian population and their determination to fight the occupying Zionist forces in Gaza, right? With these general strikes and boycotts of the administration. And we know how the state reacts to insurrection, because within just 13 months, 332 Palestinians were killed, and a high percentage of that were children, right, were Palestinian youth. And the global diffusion of the images with soldiers beating, terrorizing, killing Palestinian youth, I mean, as we've always seen by perpetrators of state violence, that instead of addressing the violence and abolishing it, they reform it, right? So the Zionist forces, just as they learned from the American forces, instead of reducing the violence, they modify it, right? They make it slightly more humane, right? And adopt these more semi-lethal attacks.
Less
on
lethal, yeah. You know, it's less lethal.
Semi-lethal.
It's still lethal, but it's less lethal.
Exactly.
Right?
And I think that's when we talk about insurrection movements and reactions against it by the state. that's the type of violence we have to discuss.
Yeah, and you know, and speaking under this idea of resistance, I think it's always so crucial to tie together how the indigenous peoples all around the world, always, whenever confronted with settler colonialism, always responded the same way. They always said, fuck that. Right? Like, this has to be acknowledged within this every single time. This is not something that anybody is ever interested in.
Yeah, like in Palestine, you can talk about it from 1917, and in the U.S., right, we talk about it since 1492.
Yep.
Right, from the jump.
Yep.
The indigenous people have resisted colonization, settler colonization, specifically.
So, yeah, and so I think as we keep walking through this history, you know, we were just talking about the First Intifada, which was in 1987. And then in March of 93, you start seeing another manifestation of the settler colonial state, and this is sort of this sanction aspect to things, where you start shutting things down economically, isolating them, creating disaster within that space, for starving people, right, depriving them of income or ability to build community.
Exactly, and we know how strategic white supremacy is. We know how strategic
Always.
settler colonialism is. This is not an accident, right? So Palestine under occupation, right, has experienced its villages, its homes, its families being intentionally demolished by Zionist occupying forces, right? Continuously destroying homes, raiding homes, stealing items, destroying land, destroying access to food sovereignty, right? Like, this is what they do. They dissect the people at their core strategically so that they have no power to fight back, right? Because we know that we can't fight back against the settler state when we are hungry, when we are starving, when we do not have shelter, right? And that's why the work that is done by the people in those communities to fight back and provide their people resources during the occupation, during the violence, is what shows, right, the insurrection against state violence that is ongoing within these colonized places.
Right, and the way in which this narrative is manufactured that says, you know, look at these people, you know, look how poor they are, look, they're starving, this, that, and the other, even though you're the one who created the situation. And I'm providing yourself, the state settler colonial apparatus, as the only sort of way to rectify this.
With the nonprofits.
With nonprofits.
Sorry.
But then also looking at this as like, yo, this is like 55 years. This is like 55 years of this project, and understanding, you know, how just absolutely disgusting the Zionist movement is in cloaking itself in the Holocaust, in cloaking itself, right? Any critique of Zionism is anti-Semitism, right? This is just, I mean, it's so, like, absolutely absurd.
Yeah,
you
right,
know?
and strategic, right?
Strategic,
We know that.
strategic. Constantly
and-
placing yourself as the victim.
Yeah, and another one of those strategies specifically in Palestine are the practice of checkpoints. So you want to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so I mean, there are over 600 checkpoints throughout the West Bank which restrict Palestinians' mobility in their own homeland, right? So you can't even move around this space freely without being surveilled by the police state.
Yeah.
And since 1967, the Zionist entity has implemented a policy of movement restrictions, including, like, not only just these checkpoints, but man-made earth mounds, trenches, roadblocks, walls, even just the way
intricate systems, right?
Yes,
Like
intricate systems.
very
Even just the way that they design travel permits, right, as these, you know, incredibly violent and stressful interactions that an oppressed person has to have with the state in order for the state to allow them free movement within their own land.
And again, right, they're made to make it impossible for Palestinians, for the people experiencing this violence, to go to schools, hospitals, work, and their own homes. And I think, again, like, we have to always draw connections back, right, to our movements here, because we might not experience things the same way, but when we look inside of black and brown and black and indigenous neighborhoods in the United States, right, the conditions are such that it feels impossible to go to schools, hospitals, work, and to our own homes. It's not checkpoints, right, but it's strategic lateral violence, right, that is caused by the state through a number of different, like, symptoms and mechanisms of colonialism, right? Every institution that makes it impossible for black and indigenous people and brown people to navigate safely, right? Period. In our own neighborhoods, in our own homes, right? And so, I think when we talk about the checkpoints in Palestine, right, we can draw connections back to. And I was listening to, it was a Zoom teaching with liberation fighters in Palestine who were doing it in partnership with some folks out of Chicago. And one of them was talking about how when they visited Chicago for the first time, walking into a corner drugstore felt like a more occupied territory than spaces that they go to in Palestine, than the checkpoints that they navigate through in Palestine, right? Pulling up into a drugstore, right, that is usually Arab owned, right? Which, again, this is an Arab person experiencing it. So there's this cognitive dissonance, right, in that. And he's recognizing it actively. And he's walking in, he sees the bulletproof glass. He sees the shotgun beside the dude's hand door, right? We see all the cameras, right? And everyone is hyper surveyed walking in to get some chips in the neighborhood store, right? And so we have manifestations of these checkpoints in our own spaces, in our own neighborhoods.
Yeah,
right?
we've sort of decentered them as being what they are, right? It's
We've
just like
normalized it.
there's just like a constant assumption of the possibility of violence in every space.
Exactly.
And this is the nature of the settler colonial state.
Yeah,
You're
and I mean-
always in danger.
And that's what Foucault talks about, right? Michel Foucault talks about how that's when it has become mastered. Like that's when they have mastered the state apparatus of
Yes.
control.
Yes.
Is when it's not a visible checkpoint. It's not a visible example of you being surveyed or you being controlled. It is just always happening.
It's the perpetual state of
Even if it's not happening, you might think it's happening,
Yeah.
right? And that's when the power structure has succeeded, right, in colonizing and in making the oppressed peoples feel as if they're always controlled and always surveyed by the state. Mm-hmm. And
yeah.
And so like the restrictions of our movement, of our physical bodies, right, that limit our material realities, it affects our access to many things. But specifically, we've seen in Palestine is access to medical care, right?
Yeah.
And
It's a pressure point.
it's a pressure point, and ambulances and other emergency medical assistances don't make it past these checkpoints, right? Palestinian ambulances are stopped at checkpoints, sometimes for hours, right? And here's a quote here. In many cases, patients must leave the Palestinian ambulance, walk across the checkpoint, and get into an Israeli ambulance, a Zionist ambulance, to get to the hospital. Women have given birth at checkpoints, and many people have died because of the delays.
Yeah.
Right, and this is the Zionist military that's perpetuating this violence, right? It's everyday people.
And like even think about this, right? So like in order to get to that hospital in Zionist occupied land, you have to apply for travel permits, right? So it's this constant
And are routinely denied.
The constant reinforcing of the sort of impermissibility of freedom of movement within your own space.
Yeah.
Constantly having to check with the state apparatus for the okay.
Yeah.
You know?
I mean, and just since 2007, right, it's been reported that 360 Palestinian people died because they did not have access to medical care as a result of the Zionists' illegal siege of Palestinian land.
And, you know, and always, right, we try and sort of show the spectrum of all of these different forms of settler colonialism and how it manifests in people's lived lives, right? So, like, we were just speaking about healthcare. The same thing is true for water, right? So, like, the Zionist state is regarded as a world leader in water management, technology, and efficiency, right? I believe it's the 32nd most resilient country in the world to tackle climate change. I'm not really sure what that means, but it means something. And yet, right, this place which is internationally recognized as being so modern, right, deliberately deprives Palestinian people of those resources.
Well, yeah, but it's praised for being a free state, for having the access to the most things, right? But because the people of the Zionist state have access to free healthcare.
Oh.
Right, but the Palestinian people don't, right? And we talk about the Zionist, the people who occupy the Zionist state have access, like Gabe just said, to vital resources like water, which they're renowned for globally, apparently, right? But don't provide those resources to its population, right? To its people, and again, like we see those connections,
Right.
We know how Americans like to view America as having access to all.
Yeah,
of
let's
these
talk
amazing
about
things,
water rights for a
right?
second in America. I think it's actually a really great point, right?
Yeah.
So, like, what do we understand happens with water in this country? When water gets polluted, it gets diverted into certain areas. What are those areas? Predominantly Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. We see this over and over
We see it
and over
in Flint.
again.
We've seen it in the Dakotas. We've seen it on the Navajo reservation.
You see it in Orange County. You see it
Everywhere.
everywhere,
Everywhere.
right? And I thought there's a stat that really jumped out to me. So the World Health Organization has said that people need at least 26 gallons of water a day to maintain a healthy lifestyle. The occupation restricts Palestinians to about 18.5 gallons per day, while settlers use 79 gallons per day per person. In Gaza, it is even worse, where because of this siege, right, we were talking about the creation of scarcity, the manufacturing of scarcity, the creation of deprivation within a community, right? Because of that, 90% of the water supply in Gaza is contaminated and unfit for human consumption. So we're just, it's genocidal,
Yeah.
right?
It's genocidal, right? It's the slow death of our people, and we understand that imperialism as a global power perpetuated by the American Empire, that's what it does, is its extraction of resources from indigenous populations cause the slow death of indigenous populations, right? Via pollution, via environmental disaster, via environmental injustice, right? And we know that is what the imperial project leads to, right? The death of indigenous peoples, indigenous societies, and indigenous ways of life.
And the repopulation of that land with the settlers. And like, let's just take a moment here to drill back into where Zionism is coming from, because I think this is really crucial. Is when you look at a genocidal intent of the Zionist state, to see that cloaked, right, always back and back, always back into the safety required for the Jewish people because of the Holocaust. There's a really disgusting doublespeak going on here that I think we always need to come drill back in on. And I think the Jewish people around the world need to recognize themselves, again, as not part of the Zionist state, but part of these oppressed peoples around the world, recognizing Jewish people's solidarity with the Palestinian people. That is a much more accurate representation of the Jewish people's history in this world. To have positioned the Zionist state as the only way to protect Judaism, I don't even really know how to get my head around that. Keeps me up at night.
Yeah, I mean, again, for me, like a lot of this history and this ongoing history and this ongoing slow death, we have to recognize, right, how it's perpetuated by these carceral systems of violence, right? It's perpetuated by the military. It's perpetuated by settler police states, right? And it's maintained by them, right? And so when we say that all cops are bastards, when we say fuck your mom and your uncle and your cousin who's a cop, right? We mean it, because that around the globe, folks who have adopted carceral systems of violence that have come out of the School of the Americas, right? Settler colonials that have come out of Israeli occupying forces, Zionist occupying forces, right? And so, like, we just have to be able to draw these connections, right? We have to be able to, and we have to understand that the liberation of our people will never precede the abolition of these violent structures, of these violent militaries, of these violent police states, because they're the ones who maintain it, right? When what is it? It's protect and serve, protecting capitalism, serving these tickets, right? Like they don't. We know who they fucking work for, right? And it's consistent. It ain't us, and it's consistent from the Zionist state to the American state, and it's important, I think, before we jump into examples from our comrades classroom, and we'll play some clips, some beautiful clips from our folks who spoke on these issues in the classroom.
In much more depth than we could ever go into.
Much more depth. But like before we even get there, we have to be able to draw those connections, right, and be able to identify the ways in which that the Israeli Zionist state has colluded directly with the American imperial empire, right? And examples of this can be seen with the LAPD, right, or the LA Sheriff's Department, where Zionist occupying forces have been shipped using mutual aid programs, if you ask fucking Gavin Newsom, right, have been shipped from the Israeli state, the Zionist state, to California to observe how gang units terrorize black and brown neighborhoods in Los Angeles. Right, and in LA, they just observe the way in which the LAPD terrorizes black and brown people, so they can take those tactics, take those skills, take millions of dollars of equipment, hundreds of millions of dollars of equipment, bring that back to Palestine and use it to violently erase the Palestinian people from that land.
And centering, right, this iteration of settler colonial capitalism, right? It's not
Exactly.
just the Zionist state operating by themselves. It's this communication. So you have funding, you have munitions, you have all the weapons coming from the American imperial system into the Zionist system to be experimented, right, with on the Palestinian people. And then the IDF, or the different mechanisms of the Zionist police state, come back to LA and they train the LAPD in how these different tools can be most effectively used to oppress people, right? So it's this constant dialogue back and forth. Meanwhile, the way that we are taught history, the way we discuss history, is always talking about these things in isolation, right? In a vacuum, placing them out of all historical context.
But we know in America, the American Empire knows damn well the only way to maintain its imperial power, right, which imperialism is the final stage of capitalism, is to collude with other imperial projects and to dismantle and destroy and erase other socialist communist projects that worked as direct agents against the imperial power, right?
Right, and not to say that the socialist state is our salvation, right? Because we
Not at all,
understand that it's
not
not.
at all.
But
We know that.
But that the only state mechanism that has any sort of ability for self-defense
to put us on the
within
path
this-
of dismantling the imperial empire, right, is the socialist state, is the communist state, right? We'll break that down like throughout this podcast series.
we always come back to this. We always come back to that.
But like that's the thing I think we have to as we finish up kind of just like the history of it, it's understanding the ways in which the American imperial project has worked to completely fund and bankroll the Zionist project.
And so before we transition into our much more brilliant comrades sort of expounding on this.
So you have to stop listening to two fucking mask-presenting voices.
Damn right. You don't want to hear us talk about shit anymore. But we're going to read a list of demands that exist within this Palestine 101 document provided to us by PYM. So you want to go ahead, Daniel?
Yeah. So stop the Zionist occupation and colonization of Palestine. Full support for the Palestinian resistance. Freedom for the Palestinian prisoners, the return of Palestinian refugees, stop the complicit silence of the international community, and support for BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel. And now that we've addressed these, it's reminding me we forgot to talk about, right, when we go back to those first two key movements, right, in the throughout the Palestinian occupation that caused refugees, right, to not be able to return back to their land. One of the key demands of the anti-Zionist project, or the anti-Zionist movement, has to center the right of return.
Yes.
Right, has to center
Always,
the right
always.
of return. And land back and decolonization, right? Like we have to center that, and we haven't got to that. We didn't hit that yet, but a lot of folks in the podcast talk about this idea or this demand of right to return. So I think that also offers a good transition into the excerpts from the podcast. From the classroom.
That's right. All power to the people.
Shout out.
Your touch leaves me at a loss of breath. Conversations, they lasted from one day to the next. That when you're close, my heart I can't contain in my chest. Truly exceptional beauty, and your lovely caresses. Medicine for my soul, and all of my stress. You making me better, you my Asada, you my Afidi, my Angela Davis, my queen, my Nefertiti, my rock when I'm feeling weak. You're what I see when I dream, cause when we're together, there's nothing that comes between us. When we're together, there's nothing that comes between, yeah. It's that motherfucking labor of love, Yeah. That labor of love, It's that labor.
Hey y'all, thank you so much for inviting us on here. I'm from the PYM, which is a grassroots community org that brings together Palestinian and Arab youth to organize for the liberation of our homelands and the right of return for all refugees, the complete dismantling of Zionism. We do like a lot of these like political ed sessions, work against Zionist policies, against different surveillance programs that target our communities, as well as develop mutual aid resources and guides and campaigns to free political prisoners, to just so you all know like a little bit of what our work is. And yeah, like if you all want to keep up with us on social media, I can like drop that.
Word. So in my mind, the important thing about settler colonialism as like the beginning framework for Palestine and not occupation is that it centers the right of return into our activism, right? Because if we think like, oh, Palestine is occupied, then if you get rid of occupation, then there's like, things are chilling. But no, it's like, it's colonized. And so it centers the right of return, which is something that past couple of months I've been thinking a lot about more with my SJP, and also thinking about what Rashid Khalidi says about Balfour Declaration being tantamount to a declaration of war against Palestinians, which I really like because then you can apply thinking about settler colonial law as being declarations of war. And that's also something I've been thinking about a lot.
Again, thanks for inviting us again to the People's Coalition. Building off your point, it makes me think about like what it means for us to be demanding right of return and for our land back, because it's just like, especially when we think about how when like in the current discourse, like people talk about Palestine as a struggle against apartheid, and they also talked about South Africa that way. But when, and this is something when we went to South Africa, we really learned this, that when we're talking about apartheid as the problem, it kind of, then the solution to that would be integration within the current state, or like having equal rights within the state. But it doesn't mean that we get our land back, or it doesn't mean that we have full sovereignty, or that we get that right of return. So it's like, how do we move beyond that thinking too? And like, what does right of return actually look like? And what does that actually mean? And how can we think beyond those framings that have kind of limited, apartheid is one aspect of Zionism, but it is not the entirety of Zionism. This is a settler colonial state, and that's where kind of like the liberal Zionists will stop. They'll say, oh, well, yeah, we're all for Palestinians having equal rights, but within our state. But if we demanded our right of return, that's where it's too far. So that's just kind of what I think about too when we're demanding the right of return and what it means to like really dismantle Zionism and dismantle settler colonization.
So I think it was really interesting how a lot of people are bringing up a lot of like connections between U.S. settler colonialism and Israeli settler colonialism, and I was reminding me of how the U.S. I think provides military aid to the Israeli military that kind of helps to like further, colonize Palestine. And so I thought it was interesting how they kind of have so many similarities, and they also are like helping each other to do that. So you kind of feed off of each other and creates more oppression.
Yeah, I was just gonna comment on like in trying to like, I think Nathan put a comment a little farther up about drawing parallels also between the types of like people are willing to like, like, oh, I'll give you these equal rights to citizenship within this existing structure, but if you try to knock the structure down, then fuck you. But then also thinking about how there's so many, like, even in the mutual aid, like in one of the mutual aid sort of programs or whatever, there was a faculty member that was a huge donor, and they're all for this, like, oh, fuck U.S. prisons, all this shit. And then when they find, sorry, I'm cursing a lot, they're all like, down for abolishing prisons and sort of like radical things like that. But then when they find out that we're, aligned with, like we're pro-Palestinian liberation, then they pulled out. And there's this like people that are willing to, be down for this much quote unquote radical change within the U.S. like think that like I feel like somehow it ties into this, like, oh, like they pull the card like being anti-Zionist is being anti-Semitic, and like people that are down for abolition here are not down for Palestinian liberation. I just like I don't know. That's just like extra sick twisted to me.
I think it was such like an interesting point how we brought it up initially about the difference when we speak about apartheid versus when we actually demand land back and the right to return. And I feel like it's such a parallel between the idea of neoliberalism here in the U.S. with settler colonialism here and back there, and that people are tiptoeing around it and not essentially fully getting to the idea that settler colonialism, there is no way to get liberation without essentially receiving all land back. For example, when people talk about a two-state solution versus a one-state solution in Palestine and Israel, and it's like saying that is essentially just ignoring the fact that settler colonialism is the issue in Palestine. And that's such like a liberal ideology of, both Palestinians and Israelis deserve rights and to live together, rather than essentially seeing it as, well, it was originally Palestinian land, and that's the only way to get liberation, the right to return completely. And that's something we see here too, when people ignore the idea of abolition and the idea of indigenous people getting the right to govern and getting their land back, essentially. So that's like one parallel, I don't know what the word is, the parallel between both, here, settler colonialism and in Palestine. And also, normalization of Zionism using the language of peace are more detrimental than the right wing says. That's very true. It's more harmful to bring up the idea of, liberal Zionism and people who see it as needing peace, when really the only way that you can get liberation is Palestinians completely getting the right to return and land back. But I just thought that was an interesting point.
Oh, hey. I just wanted to start off by saying that I'm really grateful for this space. I looked through like all the readings we're gonna have, and it looks really fucking dope. I'm really hyped. I like the readings that were assigned to us like on Monday, because I did get to know like more about Palestinian history, which I wasn't really aware of. And I already like that I'm learning the proper language, I guess, because language is important. It's important not to call what's happening like occupation, not a conflict, because it's clearly one side, Israel being the aggressor and the oppressors towards Palestine and the Palestinian people. I'm not sure exactly who was the person who said this in this group, but they were talking about people not being, or about land back and that whole situation. And it kind of reminded me of something that's in this book that I'm reading called The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, how the world is divided between the oppressors and the oppressed, and how the oppressors, for them to be, so to exist, is to have and to conquer and to oppress, like just by them being. So for them to conceive of like land back or abolition or anything like that is like, it's like inconceivable for them. And so that has been a really interesting read. But yeah, that was it.
I wanted to share that, Ghassan Kanafani was really, really against this idea of peace talks, because he's right. They've never heard of a talk between a colonialist case and a national liberation movement. There's no talk there. But I wanted to share that the detrimental effects, I'm sure before I hopped on, y'all got into this, of the Oslo Accords or the peace accords, and really how harmful they were to our movement. So in 1993, there was this peace process called the Oslo Accords between the Zionist state and the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which until 93 had centralized the leadership of various Palestinian political groups and drove a lot of our revolutionary program within Palestine and all across the diaspora wherever we'd been scattered. And when these peace accords were signed, obviously against the consent and will of the Palestinians, it stipulated that these peace accords stipulated that all Palestinian governance would be controlled and mediated through Israel. And basically, with the PLO heads signing this, they traded our liberation struggle for a state-making process with a Palestinian Authority, basically collaborationist, not even a government, that basically just carries out the interests of the Zionist state. And with this agreement, as soon as the Oslo agreements happen, the PLO becomes defunct, no longer representative of Palestinian aspirations for liberation. Our demands for liberation become illegible, where it's like, well, here you have a state-making process, why I demand liberation? And it basically it turned into the Palestinian Authority of this arm of the Israeli occupation. And as a consequence, all of our institutions crumbled. There was no longer a clear revolutionary vision for liberation, no centralized force pushing that, no body moving it forward. The popular mass organizing around national liberation collapsed. There were so many chapters of the General Union of Palestinian Students, for example. After the Oslo Accords, only one remains in San Francisco State. And this is what Ghassan Kanifani was warning against. And this is where we emerge from, as the Palestinian youth movement, we're that generation after Oslo that we did not grow up experiencing what it was like to live in a time where we had a body moving forward, a liberation vision for the Palestinian people. And we grew up in a time of fragmentation among the Palestinian parties. So with the Palestinian youth movement coming into formation about a decade ago, it was served to be a political home for us as Palestinian youth, completely grassroots, 100% movement focused, to create a space to unify all Palestinian youth across political backgrounds, to find a place for our struggle and to kind of assume that responsibility and role in our struggle, and to find a place where we could learn our political history and practice that liberation ethic and revolutionary organizing, and a place to have that revolutionary optimism. And it's been everything that we learn, we learn in the struggle, in the PYM. More than any other space that we're in, or in spaces like these grassroots spaces where we're teaching each other and talking to each other about revolution and movements. And I also just wanted to name that when we saw in the 60s, 70s, liberation movements also transnationally connecting with each other, and how powerful that was, and how severe the crackdown and repression of the US state was, the prison industrial complex being created or expanded literally in response to the Black Power movement. It just goes to show how powerful not only the struggles are, but how when they're also connected and exchanging tactics, strategies, sharing visions, how incredibly powerful that is. So yeah, just wanted to offer those thoughts.
I savor. It's the labor. You know I savor.
Yeah. Come on now. It's double MC, baby. Yeah, y'all know what it is. Labor of love, y'all. Come on.
Pónganse de acuerdo para que le pongan todo lo que está ahí, la comida y lo que usaron.